Dmitri, you're looking so dapper. I just love your outfits.
This is the famous thread jacket. I had to wear it because people make fun of me for the plaid jackets, but it's kind of become a trademark. My black turtleneck.
It is your trademark. By the way, when I went back and looked at all of the pictures of you online, just to refresh my memory, you always had a really interesting jacket on. So I know what to get you for Christmas this year. Sure. Thank you. All right, well, let's get started, Dmitri. I just want to say thank you, first of all, that you came on board. I mean, my friend, you and I go way back, and look you in the eye and just say thank you. You are one of the most amazing people in cyber. And I mean that with a guy who's been in the trenches with you a long time. And I'm just so proud of you, of everything you've accomplished, and so humble, so hardworking, so honest, and all the attributes I just love, and you've got them all. And thank you for coming on and having a little fireside chat with me. All right.
Thank you so much for having me, Dave. You've been a mentor to me for so many years. I'm so grateful for the opportunities you've given me over the years, and great to be with you today.
Well, just for the viewers, like IQ Dmitri really high, and Dave not as high, but EQ, I'll try to get you on EQ a little bit. We'll see. Anyway, hey, listen, I want to tell your story for a minute because you and I have a lot in common, and we're just going way back with what you've done in your career and things, and coming to the United States from Russia in 1994, amazing, an immigrant, some of the places you live, some of the things your father did, some of the early days of you sort of learning to code and, coming up through the cyber world. And ultimately you and I met when I was CEO of McAfee, we acquired Secure Computing. And it's kind of weird to say love at first sight, but I really enjoyed meeting you, and we've had a great relationship ever since. But ultimately, you ran all of our threat research at McAfee, which I never knew how good you were going to be until some of the big operations that you were able to unveil there, and I'm going to get to that in a minute. But then your whole career after you left McAfee, founder of Crowdstrike, the most successful company in the history of cyber. Lord knows I tried to beat that with some of my companies here, but just congratulations building Crowdstrike to where it was. And you being in the middle of the arena, I like to call you the man in the arena, kind of the Tom Brady-like analogy, but in the world of cyber, because not only were you in the middle of a lot of the epiphanies we had in our McAfee days, but then with Russia and the activities with Fancy Bear, Cozy Bear, the elections, the DNC, and then a million more. And ultimately to the work you're doing now with the Silverado Policy Accelerator, with your institute at Johns Hopkins. Not only are you honest, humble, hardworking, you're a great humanitarian. So let's go back a little bit if we can. I'm going to do like a little like Christmas past, Christmas present, Christmas future kind of thing. And let's go back and talk the past. And you helped me, name my company NightDragon, but we had three big announcements, one called Aurora, one called NightDragon, and one called Shady Rat. And I always like to say I couldn't call the company Shady Rat, so I picked NightDragon. And you are the author of all of that. Go back a little bit when you first started kind of realizing the gravity of the situation and realizing we had a major nation state perpetrating some pretty interesting things on, some of the companies we were working on. What was that like? And what were you thinking back then when you were starting to do all that?
Absolutely. Well, great to be with you. Thanks so much for having me, Dave. So early January of 2010 was really an event that redefined my entire career, changed my life in many ways. And that was when I had an offsite working for you at McAfee with my team in Atlanta. And I get a call from my good friend, Heather Atkins, who runs security at Google. And she tells me that they have a certain issue, and a number of McAfee customers were impacted by it as well. And she wanted to work with us to try to figure out what was going on and try to help those customers. And as we started pulling on the threads and looking at the details of those attacks, I sort of sat back and said, oh my God, this is one nation state and looks to be China. And this is really the first time we've ever seen a nation state go after private companies. I mean, we've known that they conduct espionage, of course, targeting governments, but this is the first time they're attacking Google, they're attacking major defense contractors and many other companies. And I named it Aurora because Aurora is a famous battleship in Russia that fired the shot in 1917 that signaled to Lenin to start the revolution. It's been called the shot heard all over the world, that changed the course of the 20th century with of course, the communist government taking place in Russia. And I really thought that that event in those early hours of analyzing the malware was going to change everything for the security industry. And I think I've been right, because the rise of APTs, of course, and nation states is all that we talk about these days. But at the time, it was unprecedented in 2010, 11 years ago, to even think about the fact that a nation state may be coming after you. And a lot of people were really pushing back, saying this can be a nation state, this has to be crime, nation states don't do this. Because I think in many ways they were uncomfortable with the idea that you're fighting a foreign military, a foreign intelligence service with billions of dollars in budget, thousands of people, enormous capabilities. How do you even wrap your head around that? And it was an enormous challenge that really needed to change the entire industry, and I think it has. And I like to say, without Aurora, there wouldn't have been a CrowdStrike, because that was what really led me on this path of realizing that everything needed to change, from the technology, from the approach that we take towards the threat, the attribution needs to be front and center. So it was a really, really key moment. And then after Aurora, I sort of asked the question, well, is this the only thing that's happening? Is this a one-off, or is there more? And I started pulling on the threads, and all of a sudden realized, well, wait a second, they didn't just hit Google and all these tech companies and defense contractors, but you have this massive cluster of activity in the oil and gas sector, which ended up being the NightVision report, and how the Chinese for many years were infiltrating those companies, stealing their exploration data, trying to outbid them on contracts to secure oil production for China and gas production as well. And then I said, well, if this is happening in gas, if this is happening in tech, it must be happening in other sectors as well. Started looking at more data and realized that with Shady Rat, the final report at McAfee, that this was happening to literally every industry. And Shady Rat was the unveiling of the group that later Mandiant, your team at Mandiant, called APT1. Of course, the famous report that did the very specific attribution to the unit within the PLA. But Shady Rat was actually the early version of that report without the detailed attribution, but talking about the victims and how the Chinese have been doing that going back all the way to 2005, 70 different companies across numerous sectors. And that's when I really coined the phrase that many people have since repeated, but I was actually the first one to say it, is that there are only two types of companies: those that know that they've been hacked and those that don't yet know. But the implication, of course, is that everyone's been hacked. And I was widely criticized at the time when I said it. People thought I was overhyping the threat. And now I think most people appreciate that that was indeed true.
Dmitri, I mean, if anything, you underhyped the report. I mean, the media made a lot out of it. I remember being the CEO trying to manage, my public share price and the news that were coming out. I think all of the impressions we had at McAfee for the prior 3 years, you created in about a 1-week period with some of those announcements. I mean, Aurora was, I believe, one of the most seminal moments in cyber history, because also the attackers were after something a little different, right? They were after, some of the intellectual property of these companies. They were trying to compete with NightVision in ways that, the oil companies didn't realize that they could compete. And it just created a whole nother level of government on corporate attack models. And we learned during those, the dwell time was, pretty lengthy too. And that the Chinese military was in these companies for quite some time. And so it was a fascinating moment. In fact, I always tell the story a little bit too, and this was the leadership of China calling me. I remember getting a call, I think it was after NightVision, but maybe between NightVision and Shady Rat.
It was NightVision. It was because I actually went a little bit too far, probably, but I actually named one of the people that was involved in it. We didn't name him in the report, but we provided his name to reporters who called him up, and he admitted, this guy in China, that he was indeed helping to hack American companies. And I think that was probably crossing the line for the Chinese.
Well, I remember having my lawyers and everyone in the room when we got the call from the leadership of China, and sort of the, how dare you accuse China of, stealing from the United States. And it was one of those moments like, wow, are you actually saying this to us as well? And we have all this proof. And, ultimately, obviously this was going on. And wow, incredible that you were at the forefront of those three attacks in a way that they were. And like I said, I've dedicated my whole career, post those attacks, particularly with my platform here, Night Dragon, that you named, to really helping to solve some of the cyber threats and the issues around it. So you had a huge effect on me. You had a huge effect on everyone around us. I think, and I want to talk about Crowdstrike next, is, I went on to, I left McAfee and we sort of parted ways. I always say sort of my biggest success and maybe even my biggest failure was, are you still there, Dmitri?
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah,
Oh,
camera went off there for a second on my side. Okay, there you go. Anyway,
yeah, I'll be right back. Keep talking, Dave. Give me a second.
I see your dapper jacket on the picture, but what I was going to say was, one of those moments was when we sold McAfee to Intel Corporation. The largest transaction in security history at the time, 7.768 billion in cash, and a lot of this was related to the great work that you had done with the threat research and the growth we had as a company. But I always say it was my biggest success, maybe my biggest failure, because after we sold McAfee to Intel, you went on to found a pretty large company. My path went over, I became chairman of Mandiant and chairman of FireEye, and you went off and founded Crowdstrike. Tell me a little bit, if you could, like, what did you learn from McAfee for a minute, and what were the foundations of Crowdstrike? Because I know there's some real important threads here for people to hear.
Well, first of all, watching you build McAfee into the behemoth security company that it was back then was just incredible experience for me, learning how to scale a company, how to hire an amazing team. I mean, the team that we had at McAfee was just phenomenal, and we hired many of them at Crowdstrike, particularly on the go-to-market side. Our friend Mike Carpenter, who ran our sales for many years, Jim Seidel, who runs it now, Scott Fuseli, who ran it originally. So many people that we were able to take to Crowdstrike.
Gerhard Wassinger, you took him, made him chairman, all those little things.
All the people that you've identified over the years and whose careers you promoted. We took advantage of that. So thank you for helping us grow and create an incredible success at Crowdstrike. But as I said, one of the things that led me to start thinking about a new way of really approaching this problem were these three reports that were critical to understanding that you have now nation states breaking into companies, and the most critical word in the APT acronym, the Advanced Persistent Threat Argument acronym, I believe is not advanced, it's the persistence, because that changes the entire game. When you have someone who is dedicated to breaking into your company, dedicated to stealing your intellectual property, perhaps disrupting your network, it changes the whole approach that you take towards cybersecurity. The old adage has always been in cyber that you don't have to outrun the bear, you have to outrun the guy right next to you. Well, if the bear really wants you, it doesn't matter who else is running. And that required a completely different shift in thinking. It required understanding of the adversary, understanding of their motivations, what do they want to go after, what are their capabilities. It required the invention of what is now called hunting, the ability to continuously look across data on your network, on your systems to identify intrusions, because they will always be coming in. You can't just sit back and wait for an alert to be generated from your antivirus. You have to go in and look at what is going on in your network, what is executing, and try to identify threats before your automated systems even can identify it. So all of those concepts were really critical to starting Crowdstrike and starting to think differently about the problem. Initially, we of course were focused very much on this APT threat. We believe that the industry was not addressing the nation state problem to a great extent. And later on, once we're able to sell them on the solution to fix the nation state problem, then we could come in and say, well, we can also solve your ransomware, we can also solve your cybercrime. And that became a lot easier for us to then go in and replace the McAfees and semantics entirely. But originally, we were just an add-on solution for the nation state problem.
Yeah, pretty amazing that some of that work that you had at McAfee really transferred over to Crowdstrike, and you learned how to build something highly scalable with the crowd empowerment too. And I did that a little bit with FireEye, you know, trying to build a community where we could learn from one another, where indicators of compromise could be shared. And, you know, you only have patient zero, you can fix the rest of the patients. CrowdStrike took this to a whole nother level in a way. Fast forward for a minute. I mean, the next man in arena moment for you, you know, came soon after that, as you started to get involved with, you know, some of the attacks, particularly a famous one with the DNC. And I don't know how much you can share here, but Lord knows there's a little bit of written about this in the public media. But you know, you were in the middle of, I think, you know, maybe the next biggest or the biggest, you know, situation the United States has ever had, perhaps the world has ever had, as the epiphany of the DNC breaches were occurring, the potential threat to democracy, the influence, the information warfare that ensued. I heard you named a couple of those attackers, some interesting terms. I know them really well, but take us back to that a minute too, just like you did with the Aurora. You know, what was going through that, and you know, what epiphanies did you have?
So the interesting thing is that we started CrowdStrike in 2011, and then DNC, of course, happens in 2016. In those intervening 5 years, we've been involved in lots of major investigations. We worked along with Mandy on the Sony hack. I was actually the first one to attribute it when Sony called me up that Monday morning asking me to look at a piece of malware that they had just discovered in their network before their network even got destroyed, and worked on some other major profiles. So by the point that 2016 rolls around, May 2016, we are doing APT investigations, just like Mandy and FireEye, on a daily basis. And as groundbreaking as Aurora and Night Dragon and Shady Rat had been 5-6 years earlier, I have to be honest with you, when we went into the DNC, it was pretty mundane initially, because it was sort of like, oh, you know, here we found Russians again in yet another organization, a political organization, not a surprise. There's a campaign going on. You know, we're going to do our usual thing, investigate, clean up, and we'll be done. And then, of course, something unprecedented happens, which is that, well, one, the customer actually asks us to go public, which almost never happens, as you know, from doing many of these yourself, Dave, that customers always want to keep this under wraps. But here they actually asked us to say publicly that we found this intrusion and provide attribution details on that intrusion. And there were actually two separate actors inside the DNC that we associated with Russian intelligence. One that we attributed to GRU, their military intelligence arm, and another that was later attributed to the SVR, their civilian foreign intelligence service. And so we came out publicly. I wrote a blog about it, and I honestly, you know, forgot about it, you know, in the next hour, because it's sort of, we're moving on and we're dealing with other intrusions. And then the next day, a blog post appears from an anonymous character called Guccifer2 that is attacking our attribution, saying that it's not Russia, it's, you know, this lone Romanian hacker who, by the way, was later found not to actually speak Romanian well. And then we, of course, have the WikiLeaks releases of emails and the Podesta emails and everything else that unfolded throughout that 2016 election. But it started out as a very, very mundane case of yet another investigation, yet another nation state attack, because by that point we were doing so many of them on a daily basis. And I realized when that Guccifer post came out that this was going to be something different, because we've never been called out by an attacker on attribution. And when they started posting the emails and the documents, it was pretty clear that this was going to be something that we've never seen before, an election interference campaign in the West. And it was quite a remarkable time to live through.
Yeah, understatement, Dmitri, for sure. You know, at the other side of this, I'm over running FireEye and Mandy while you're at CrowdStrike. So, you know, the two companies were involved with a lot of these activities. You know, just for the listeners, I don't know if you know the exact number, but I know the exact number. I was at FireEye 5 years in one day. You know, I retired one day in 5 years. I was going into it as a 3-year CEO just because it was my third time doing all that work. I stayed 5 years, retired 5 years in one day into it. But the number that's amazing, sticks in my mind, Dmitri, was 5,572. That number for me on the other side was the number of confirmed espionage breaches we discovered at FireEye and Mandiant, the two of us together during my 5 years in one day, that were confirmed sort of IP theft, espionage related activities by nation states. So this was largely on US soil attacks. So the enormity that I went through as well. On the other side, like you said, from 2011 to 2016, it was like, yep, here it is again. Yep, another one. You know, I did 5,572 of them, you know, that we were able to confirm. And, you know, it's just amazing. I'm sure your number probably is even bigger, but it's incredible for me as I went through that maturation, you know, sort of like, oh, there was hacktivism, then there was crime, and wow, now there's espionage. And now we're into like an information warfare almost stage, right? It was like, oh wow, you know, the psyche of America, the election process, the changes as we went through 2016 all the way through 2020, and you know, the battleground that cyber domain is in today is pretty amazing. So I want to move forward a little bit to, you retired now from Crowdstrike. I'm incredibly jealous and envious, I will tell you, just because what an incredible company you built. I say that tongue in cheek, but I'm so proud of you. I truly am. I mean, you were just an incredible human, but at the same time, you retired and you're now doing some cool things. I would love to hear and have you tell everybody what you're up to right now, especially with the Silverado Policy Accelerator, some of the humanitarian things you're doing now, and give everybody a little update on that if you would.
Yeah, so you know, we were joking right before we started that both of us retired, and we're now as busy as probably we've ever been. So, but it's a lot of fun to go through this experience, build an amazing company, and now sort of do the next phase of my life, which is mostly about giving back. And two of the initiatives that I have going on right now are all about that. One is Silverado Policy Accelerator, which is a nonprofit that we started to really move policy forward in the United States on a few critical issues. You know, I've always believed when it comes to cyber that you needed technology, you needed intelligence, and you needed policy to address the problem. So at CrowdStrike, I try to tackle the first two, but without policy, you really can't solve the problem because it's not just a technical problem. I have a piece that just came out this morning in the Foreign Affairs talking about how we don't have a cyber problem, we have a geopolitics problem. And at the core of it is the problem that these nation states are building enormous cyber capabilities, as you know, Dave, and they're launching attacks. China is doing economic espionage. Russia is doing disruption and influence campaigns. North Korea is stealing huge amounts of money and so forth. And they're not going to stop until we come to some sort of accommodation. And the reality is that when you look at just the United States alone, forget our allies, you have an enormous set of vulnerabilities. The great companies that can buy CrowdStrike, can buy FireEye and Mandiant will do okay, but you have so many other companies that don't even understand the problem, can't wrap their hands around it, don't have the budgets to hire the best companies and the best people. So we're always going to be vulnerable as a result of that. Your school district probably does not have the best security technology and probably never will. So you have to start thinking about how to address it from a policy perspective. And that's really what Silverado is all about. The reason we call it Policy Accelerator is because we're trying to take the venture capital approach that you take towards building great companies to policy focused on implementation. And we're doing it across three different areas. We're doing it on cyber, we're doing it on trade and industrial security. We're doing a lot of work on semiconductors, which I actually think is an even more critical problem in national security than cyber, because without chips, nothing works. You don't have a cyber problem without chips because you don't have computers, you don't have planes, you don't have microwaves, you have nothing. And then third area is environment and how do we have this transition to green tech without jeopardizing our national security. A lot of people are very interested in getting on solar, which we are fully supportive of, but you have to be thinking about how do we transition from Middle Eastern oil and all the insecurities that come from that to Chinese solar panels, and whether that makes sense or not, and how you want to do more of that in from production perspective in the United States and with allies, so you don't have this dependency on a great power competitor like China. So that's what we're doing with Silverado. A lot of it is working with policymakers here in DC, where I live, with the Hill, with administration. I know you, Dave, you spent a lot of time with this phenomenal cyber team that we now have in place between Ann Neuberger, who both of us have known for well over a decade, Jen Easterly at CISA, Chris Inglis, who was actually on our strategic council in Silverado before he became the new national cyber director, Rob Silvers as undersecretary for policy at DHS. Really the best of the best team, that the dream team on cyber. And I've had a pleasure working with each of them for many, many years, and stay in close touch and try to provide my thoughts on what we should be doing to them, as well as to representatives on the Hill to try to move legislation forward on these issues. So that's Silverado. The other piece that we just launched, because I think it's a critical problem that we have in this industry, and that is workforce. That you have the huge companies like Crowdstrikes and Fireside and Googles and Microsofts of the world that are hiring all the best people, and no one else can compete. When you look at their stock option packages, the salaries that people are getting paid, your school districts, your small businesses are never going to be able to hire great people in cyber unless we dramatically increase the pool of talent that is available. And that was the goal behind the Alperovitch Institute that we just launched with Johns Hopkins University, the School of Advanced International Studies, SICE, and it's going to be focused on creating the new crop of talented students that can go into industry and help solve some of these problems. Starting next fall, we'll have a master's student class teaching students about this intersection of policy, geopolitics, cyber intelligence investigation. We have an amazing amount of support from industry, both in terms of scholarships that will be announced shortly from some major companies for diversity students and others that want to take these classes, but also adjunct professors. We have adjunct professors from Crowdstrike, from FireEye, from Facebook, teaching people about how to conduct real world investigations. And you really can't get that anywhere else in academia. So incredibly excited about that. We'll also have a PhD program. So actually tomorrow is the deadline for people that want to apply to the PhD program, which is a fully paid ride to really build the next generation of professors, because to keep cranking out more students, you need professors. We need more professors that understand this field. So the PhD program is really critical for sustainability. And then the third piece, which we'll also launch next year, is going to be the executive ed program, which is a compressed sort of 7-8 day program for leaders in industry, in government, sort of think general officers, CEOs, board members that can come here to DC at this amazing facility that we're going to have in DC, which is the former museum building, incredible building on Pennsylvania Avenue, right in the middle between the White House and Congress, a perfect location. And you're going to be able to get trained within those week to 8 days on everything you need to know from a strategic perspective of how do you run your business and manage cyber risk. So that's what I'm focused on from a philanthropy perspective.
Wow, pretty impressive. And by the way, I should have talked to you before this because, maybe our minds think alike, but I am getting involved with a company, remain nameless for a minute, but we are looking at technology, almost security as a service that we can give to universities all over the world that can help create certifications, help get them better trained, help them with jobs. Because I think the world of cyber meets education meets technology is an opportunity. And if we can scale that to hundreds, if not thousands of universities, we can help the demographic of companies and entities that can't afford talent, like you said, K through 12 or hospitals or the ones getting hit by ransomware attacks on a hourly basis right now. So I'm looking at a company that can really help drive a systematic program for this. So maybe we can do a little partnering on that too, because we're also at RSA going to be launching a whole philanthropic drive for education purposes around some underprivileged areas who can get cyber education. So we'll compare notes, and I love what you're doing there. I'm doing the same thing from a philanthropic and a profit point of view, but trying to drive the talent shortage in a way. I want to come back to sort of this dream team for a minute and ask you a question or two, if I could. I mean, I feel like this administration has really created some incredible talent, and you just named them. I mean, we've known Ann, we've known Jen, we've known Rob, we know Chris, we can name them by first name in a way because they're dedicated humans who really have A, understand the problem, B, understand the community. I just recently hosted last week a DHS event. You might have noticed I brought Secretary Mayorkas out to Silicon Valley. First time they've come out in 20 years. We had a lot of public-private partnership conversation. We were able to, try to really start to elevate this. I know you've been in the middle of a lot of public-private, partnership, and then now wrapping policy around that, particularly with the Silverado Policy Accelerator you're doing. What do you think we have to do around just how to create a better village, like a public and private relationship in a way? You have that with CrowdStrike. I had it with FireEye, Mandy, and McAfee, but we have 3,500 cyber companies. We've got, a lot of threat sharing we could be doing better, but there's this little thing called privacy and there's a thing called security. And what's your ideas, if you have? I'm sorry to put you on the spot for it, but like, what can we do to more operationalize public and private partnerships? What can we do? And maybe the answer is some of the policy, but what else comes to your mind?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things we need to do is focus these partnerships around specific missions. It's not enough to create a group and bring everyone together and sing kumbaya. You have to focus on specific threats we're going to counter. It could be disinformation, could be intrusions from economic espionage perspective, could be disruption. And then you don't have to involve everyone. As you said, 3,000 people, that's not a public-private partnership, that's the stadium that you're filling up. It's 3,000 companies, it's even more people. You can't possibly work with all of them. So you have to figure out who are the right companies, what is the right coalition of the willing, if you will, on each one of these issues. And it's going to be different depending on the issue. Some people, on some case, you may want to bring CrowdStrike, or another case, you may want to bring Mandy in because who is working in the investigation or what have you. And that's how you need to be thinking about this from a flexible coalition building perspective. And it needs to be focused on action, not just like, let's throw some information over the fence. What do you know, what you don't know? That's the old model. That's what we've been doing for the last 10 years. We need to say, how are we going to disrupt this activity? What we're going to do to make sure that the adversary has an impact. And that's where I think we still have a ways to go. The government, despite the fact that we have an incredible team right now that believes in this and wants to do it, still is constrained in many ways by legislation and ethics processes and what have you, with working closely with industry. And classification also comes into this as well. But if you really want to achieve impact, you're going to have to work with the private sector. And I've been very privileged at McAfee and even before McAfee to have very close partnerships with the FBI in a cybercrime space long before we started doing all these nation state investigations to disrupt major botnets, disrupt major cybercrime forums that existed. Carter Planet back in 2005, working with an incredible agent, Keith Mularski from the FBI. It was the first major takedown of a huge cybercrime operation that the FBI has ever done. And I was helping along with that. And the FBI did it really, really well, because what they did is they went to industry and they said, what are your biggest problems? They asked the banking industry, they asked the cybersecurity industry and others that were involved, what botnets, what criminal groups are targeting you, where you experienced most losses. And then they ranked and stacked it, figured out who the top 3 targets were, and said, let's go together after these targets. Industry, what information do you have? Here's what information we have from a law enforcement perspective. Let's marry together. Let's build a joint op plan for how we're going to take them down, using law enforcement authorities, using intelligence communities capabilities, using what the private sector can do. I was part of one operation where it was a huge takedown, and as part of the takedown, FBI was leading the way. They had their partners internationally that were going to go into all these data centers and take down servers. And then almost at the last minute, they realized that there was one critical server in a particular country I won't name that had to be taken down, and no one sort of coordinated with that country on how to do that. And to do that through diplomatic channels would literally take a month, which we didn't have. So FBI literally said, industry, does anyone have a contact over there that can just place a call and ask for a favor? And sure enough, someone stepped forward and said, I know the owner of that company, I'll give them a call. And an hour later, that server was down. And that was really remarkable for the government to appreciate that industry, without offensive authorities, without the capabilities of the government, can still have a huge effect just through the relationships, the influence that it has with people all over the world. And we need to do more of that in the national security space and nation state investigations. And I think we still have a ways to go to get there.
Yeah, I like what you're saying about specific actions that we can take because, it's sort of like baseball analogy. I hate to say, you have to have a good first baseman, third baseman, outfielder, pinch hitter, pitcher, and each situation is a little different, right? So you have a threat over here, and maybe that's, a different group. You have a threat in the industrial sector, it's a little different group. But I really applaud the administration's team because the JCDC, as it's called, this Joint Collaborative Framework has created a series of private partnerships, not 3,000, but the right ones in some cases for the right situation. So for the first time in my observation, we've really tried to operationalize this public-private partnership around action. And this is one of the questions that came in online. I thought I'd ask you about, the administration's been battling this for the last, 3 days now. And this is the logging issue around Java, the log4j stuff. And, we heard Jen Easterly talk about this as, in her view, I don't want to put words in her mouth, was probably the biggest zero-day exploit we've seen in her history, in time. And, one of the biggest operational challenges that are out there, question being around that is like, how do we deal with that maybe? And, what do you think the severity of this logging issue is? And, any perspective on your side would be appreciated.
Yeah, I was on CNBC yesterday saying that this is, from a vulnerability perspective, by far the most severe vulnerability that I've seen in my entire career, and potentially ever. We'll see if the impact is there. There are some challenges in exploiting it. Just because a piece of software is vulnerable doesn't necessarily mean that it will be successfully exploited. There's some mitigations that people can put in, but just the pervasiveness of the software library, which, by the way, what's mind-boggling about this, and of course people in the software industry have known this, but for the general public, this is shocking, that this critical library that's literally probably in thousands of enterprise products all over the world is maintained by 3 people who do this part-time because they have jobs, and this is a hobby for them. And the reason we have this problem, which I even hesitate to call vulnerability because it's really a feature that was built into this library back in 2013, is because someone came to them and said, wouldn't it be nice if when you're logging a piece of data, you can look at that data and see if you want to execute some random piece of code based on what that data looks like. And someone said, sure, that sounds like a great idea. And there was no one there to say, well, wait a second, maybe that's not such a great idea. Maybe that would open up a tremendous hole that you can literally drive a truck through. But of course, it was 3 people, part-time, no security architecture, no reviews, and now we have this unfolding disaster that is impacting everything from your iCloud. iCloud was vulnerable, as we now know, to the Mars rover even that has this library built in, and everything in between. And the full impact of this, we will not know for years because there's so many cascading effects where you don't know how this library is built into someone's cloud service or a third-party vendor that cloud service is using, or your appliance says. And even once you're able to get all the patches out, and that alone will be a Herculean effort on the part of all these companies, it's going to take, as you know, Dave, many, many years before those patches actually get applied by most people, if they ever even do, even if they ever get applied. So this is a problem that I think is going to haunt us for many, many years. It's very easy to exploit it on many of these implementations. You literally just have to send a particular piece of string to a device that's doing the logging, and you get an automatic shell on that machine, automatic code execution. And it's easy to evade detection. That's done at the network layer because you can encode this string in many different ways. There's even an attack vector right now that people are looking at where you can send an image to a device, and based on how it parses out that image, you can compromise that device. So you're going to have a huge set of problems. And one of the things that I'm watching out for and very concerned about is that we know that there are criminal groups right now that are trying to develop a worm, a self-propagating worm that can go around and literally scan the entire internet and hit everything that's connected, both externally and internally within companies, and compromise them. And potentially you could use this for ransomware operations, like we saw with Kaseya back in July. So that would be very, very concerning. Right now, we're mostly seeing crypto miners, and we're seeing some nation states that are now doing intrusions using this capability.
Dmitri, not to stop your flow there for a second, but you know how fast the attackers can react when a vulnerability of this size and scale is out there. As we speak, we're starting to see the test trials of all of that already. So, this is a theater that we live in where the attackers get good at using these vulnerabilities to quickly create exploits. Like you said, this could take years for us to really see the full extent of it. Whereas even in the SolarWinds Kaseya cases, it was a little shorter period. This one may take a lot longer. Brings me to a question that I'm curious your thoughts of. When you sort of look now at the Log4j issue, the bigger problem really is the software assurance of our supply chain, right? I mean, at least one man's view, when you look at how products are coded and built, and I've been building for 30 years as a leader of these companies. I mean, the open source that's coming in, like you said, 3 developers are managing this, right? Back in 2013. And, open source, the way in which we get code, the way in which we, don't really harden it very well, the global ecosystem of the software supply chain and hardware supply chain seems to be one of our biggest challenges that we're facing. And I think this administration has called that out. They have, some initiatives in place that came out of the executive order. I know, for infrastructure, they call it SBOMs, but these software bill of materials that you would have to report to essentially sell back through DISA or through GSA contracts to the government. How can companies figure this out, considering, Log4j was around for a long time? I mean, A, do you agree this is a big problem? And B, what do you see us doing to fix it?
I agree it's a huge problem. I actually think the fix here is fairly easy because most companies actually have a handle on their software because they have to from just enforcement of software licenses perspective. As you know, Dave, we've acquired so many companies over the years at McAfee and of course in other companies as well. The first thing you do when you do due diligence is you ask for their list of software, what open source they use, what licenses those open source packages have, so that you don't have a copyright infringement issue on your hands or license infringement issue. And so the software exists, the Black Ducks of the world and many other companies that give you software will scan your repository and tell you everything that's there. So technically that's a solved problem. Now we need to make sure that those companies are actually providing these SBOMs to the government, to their customers, frankly, as well. And everyone has visibility and doesn't have to keep guessing of, is this piece of software using Log4j or no? This should be public, should be on their website ideally. Here's a list of all of our software packages, and you'll immediately know if someone is potentially vulnerable to this.
Do you feel as though, because part of the problem is, understanding, creating visibility to that software supply chain and potentially hardware supply chain here, right? I mean, you alluded to the semiconductor problem, and you and I both know the semiconductor, the code around it, the BIOS, everything underneath that firmware is a very interesting world when it comes to security and national security and where that gets touched. But also in the software assurance, we know a lot of Eastern Europe is very active in the, software developer game. We understand those shell organizations and outsourced development that, let's just say, has insiders in it that can be, shall we say, malicious. And so really trying to get assurance that a whole supply chain, there's one creating visibility, but then who touches it, what backdoors might have been put into it, how to create certainty of that. Something I think, personally, I think we got to work on, as a nation, but also as a world, to create better certainty of this, because one little exploit like this can affect a big thing, obviously.
I think this is the one thing that has not been well understood by our industry, both the cyber industry and the broader enterprise software industry. And when you think about it, if you go back to Aurora and this appreciation that nation states are now coming after you. Well, nation states and intelligence agencies don't just come after you with cyber means. They have tremendous human intelligence capabilities to place people inside companies, to recruit them, to get them to do certain things. We've now had a number of cases, the famous case that Justice Department just prosecuted and got a conviction of a Chinese intel officer who was recruiting people inside GE to literally give him intellectual property. You may remember in 2010, we had this famous case of Russian illegals that were arrested, that were being watched by the FBI for 10 years and then ultimately arrested and kicked out of the country. Well, one of them, people forget now, but was working for Microsoft, had a job as a software developer at Microsoft. You had a case last year with Tesla where a criminal group, in this case, a Russian criminal group, was trying to recruit an insider within Tesla to deploy ransomware on their network. That insider actually went to the company and reported them and worked with them to arrest an individual that was trying to bribe him with $1 million to deploy ransomware. I mean, how many companies in this country have employees that would decide not to report someone approaching them with $1 million, but decide to actually take action? I bet a lot. And that's something that I think the industry has not grappled with, this threat of a human threat, the human insider that is within the company acting maliciously, or perhaps sitting there doing nothing but legitimate activity, but when they get called upon at a particular point in time, they can inject a backdoor, they can disrupt the network or do other things that would be devastating to the company. And how do you deal with that when you've got 100,000 software engineers, as some of these huge tech giants do? That becomes an enormous challenge. And obviously, no one wants to surveil their employees and treat them as if they're criminals. That creates culture issues, and there are obviously legal challenges to even doing that well. Enormous challenge. The government in some ways has it much easier because they can put people through polygraphs, full background investigations that Dave, you and I have gone through many times.
Yeah.
Yeah, but industry can't do that. Try to recruit anyone and ask them to go through polygraph, they'll laugh at you and take another job elsewhere. So it's a huge challenge.
Before I get to Christmas future, I want to talk a little bit about that in a minute as we wrap up, but a lot of questions about Silverado. And let me ask a little bit more, because I think you touched a lot of people with this, at least in our world here. One of the questions here, just for Silverado's growth, what upstream changes to education would you like to see to increase the number of students and candidates in this field? So what can be done here to really increase that from your perspective?
So the biggest challenge is less on Silverado and more on the Alperovitch Institute. That's where we focus our educational efforts, is really how to scale it. Because to provide a quality education, you can't have 1,000 people in a classroom, even remotely. That just doesn't work. So it has to be small, but hopefully, there'll be other institutions that will take the model of what we're doing with Johns Hopkins and apply it elsewhere, so you can scale it up, because the demand is there. I mean, luckily, there's so much money in this industry. We were talking about this earlier, Dave, so much venture funding that people appreciate that with a degree in cybersecurity, they'll be able to take their pick of jobs and make a lot of money through stock options and salaries and what have you. It's about really making sure that we have a pipeline to train them the right way and educate them to become great leaders. And that's where I think we're failing. We're failing across the board, from K through 12 to bachelor's and graduate degrees. And we're just trying to tackle it from a graduate perspective with one institution, but we hope that others will take the lead. It's been great for me to work with other entrepreneurs that have been very successful in this industry. I think Ron Gula is on this call. I saw his name earlier. He's been doing phenomenal work with his philanthropy, and it's been great to work with him. And Craig Newmark from Craigslist and others that have been very generous with their time and with their resources to try to solve this problem.
Yeah, I love it. I appreciate all those efforts and can't agree more. This is our future. We need the younger generations trained, educated, and at an advanced level, because like you said, this is probably our biggest challenge. Is aside from sort of the geopolitical you mentioned, it's the talent, right? And being able to get that talent dispersed. So I love what you're doing. Let's talk about the future if I can. I hate to scare people on the holidays here, but I love asking you, because you've been in the middle of this, like I said, the man in the arena here a little bit. But as we look at the future, Dmitri, I built this whole platform, Night Dragon, to really think about the dislocation of what offense can do and what the defense can provide. I mean, everybody who's an LP and a shareholder in my world knows I say those exact words constantly. Dislocation between offense and defense. I find the gaps. I try to find commercial defense. I try to scale it. It's what you did with Crowdstrike, what I tried to do with FireEye. I'm now trying to do it many times in many different sectors. And wherever I see problems, from satellites to UAVs to crypto to supply chain, I try to find companies and solve it. What couple areas, if I could, maybe just name one, I'll name one, maybe we'll go back and forth for a second, but what area keeps you up at night right now? Is there an emerging sector? I know you're on a few boards and things, what's worrying you right now going forward?
So like you, I'm trying to stay close to the industry and help future entrepreneurs to build the next Crowdstrike, the next FireEye. One of the companies I'm very excited about, I know your shareholder is Dragos, in the OT space, really focused on, we've done a lot of work on securing the IT part of the network. What about the OT part that actually runs the physical systems, runs your gas plants, runs your infrastructure, electric utilities, water utilities, chemical plants, pharmaceutical companies, you name it. All of that physical infrastructure has to be run by programmable logic controllers and HMI systems, human machine interfaces that can be hacked. And we've now seen a few cases where results could have been potentially devastating. Triton, one of the cases that both Dragos and FireEye worked on, this refinery in the Middle East that was compromised by what we now know were the Russians, that were going after the safety controllers, the thing that keeps the facility from going boom, right? And they were trying to disable that safety controller. If they had succeeded, dozens of people probably would have died as a result of that attack. So I think we'll see more and more of those attacks as the geopolitical tensions increase. And one of the things I'm watching very carefully right now is this whole situation in Ukraine. I'm pretty convinced that Vladimir Putin is likely to invade in the coming months. And if he does invade, the relations between Russia and the West, obviously already at a low point, will completely crater. And you're going to see inevitably repercussions in cyberspace as a result of it. The Russians are incredibly capable actors, and it's a very worrisome situation.
And, just echoing what you said, having been involved with the OT ICS space for a long time and watching Dragos grow and another company, Clarity, that I'm involved with, but, watching these sectors really expand. I mean, this is the art of warfare and cyber warfare where kinetic meets cyber, and it's real. These industrial networks, the safety control systems are vulnerable. We know less than 5% of those systems around the world actually have a security system that can detect and prevent. This is a big market and a big important area, because we learned in some of even the ransomware scenarios like NotPetya and stuff where they weren't air gapped and control systems were brought down by accident even, let alone by malicious attempts. So it's pretty important.
There's no such thing as an air gap anymore. I mean, maybe you still have it in the nuclear facilities, but even then, when we go do assessments, we find that someone plugged in a router or something into a network they shouldn't have. But that's really the only facility out there now where you have regulations that enforce the air gap. But everywhere else, there's no such thing. Everything is connected to the internet. Even classified networks are connected to the internet because you have these things called guards. Because at the end of the day, if you want to be productive, you have to exchange information from the low side to the high side and back and forth. So we've seen attacks that traverse that air gap. The famous attack in 2008, Buckshot Yankee, that we worked on at McAfee back in those days, where the U.S. government found classified Russian malware on a classified network across the DoD. Those things do happen. We know it, and I think we're going to see a lot more of it.
Yeah, no doubt about it. One of the things I've tried to do here with Night Dragon is keep looking at the domains around cyber that I also am up, worried about at night. I think about air and space as those two domains as well. Mankind launched, I think it was, 1,536 satellites up through 2018. We're averaging 10,000 a year now or more. Each of the launches are 65, 70 microcube satellites going in low Earth orbit. Everything that we have on the ground is connecting up now, instead of the fiber optic networks that we've had, how to secure that, how to do good Earth observation with that. We're involved with a pretty cool company called Hawkeye 360 that's doing a lot of work doing, signal intelligence augmentation, Earth observation, climatology, meteorology applications, you name it, they can do it from space with a whole new set of technologies. Pretty incredible. I keep looking for those things that you built. I call it crowd, cloud, and AI. Right? Those are the underpinnings in these markets. If you can create crowd empowerment, crowdsourcing of intel, use AI and ML to learn quickly, leverage cloud deployment and hyperscale, you can meet the threat pretty quickly at area. So let me ask you the last one here before we wrap up. What's your thoughts on crypto and security? Everybody wants to know. I'm sure you get asked all the time. How secure is it? What do you worry about crypto?
So before I get there, just to address your last point, I spend a lot of time these days working on geopolitical issues. In fact, General David Petraeus is a chairman of our strategic council at Silverado, and spent a lot of time with him and others thinking about what the future conflict looks like. We just got out of 20 years of fighting wars with people that have AK-47s, but future conflict, if we get into one with China, God forbid, or Russia, is going to be very, very different, right? And cyber is going to be a huge element of it, but also space. The first thing we should expect is that our space assets will be targeted, and we'll probably target theirs. We'll be blind, and all of our GPS guided munitions, all of our satellite surveillance and everything else will probably be off within the first minutes of the fight. So thinking through how do we fight through in a resilient manner with weapon systems that are so networked. I mean, the F-35 is literally connected to the internet. It's connected to the ground, and the ground network is connected to the internet. It's mind-boggling, the vulnerabilities that presents. So enormous challenge, not just in the cyber realm and for everyone else working on software, but with real-world kinetic implications.
By the way, you got to check out this cool company for a second, Dmitri, because I'm right with you with the space challenge. Is a company that does high altitude, long endurance UAVs that can put mesh networks in the sky in minutes. And we basically can put fleets of these up in the air, create Earth observation, put networks up in the sky in emergency scenarios. I mean, it could be wildfire or FEMA, but could also be in a war environment or battle environment. So, there's always the, technology that can help you.
Exactly. I'm a chess player, as you can see from my background. And one of the things I think we don't do enough of in cyber is think through the next move that the adversary always has to play. Whatever we do, there'll be a counter move to that. And it's important to think that through. But back to crypto, look, I think the DeFi ecosystem is incredibly interesting. There's some great companies in the space. Chainalysis is one that I've been tracking for a while in terms of understanding fraud that's taken place in the blockchain ecosystem, and there are many others. And the opportunities that it creates are enormous, but the security challenges are just massive. And I do wonder if you're going to have the successful transition to the Web3 DeFi ecosystem, if it's so easy to steal wallets. I was just talking to a friend of mine who bought some Bitcoins early on, had them hosted at an exchange, didn't really pay attention to it, logged in, about a month ago, checked it, it was worth millions, and then logged in, a few weeks later, and it was gone. Someone broke into that exchange, stolen the keys, and stolen the wallet. Millions of dollars just vanished, right? That is happening every day. When you look at these smart contracts, they're code. What do we know about code? It has vulnerabilities. And we've seen so many vulnerabilities in these smart contracts that can be reused to steal hundreds of millions of dollars in cryptocurrency. Until we find a better way to architect these things and make it more resilient, and really fundamentally find a way to retrieve the money, right? So the thing that's mind-boggling about crypto is that it's irreversible. Someone steals your wallet, that's it. There's no getting back. I mean, if you have a bank robbery, at least you can call law enforcement, you can stop the wire transfers, going through the traditional financial system. There's none of that in the crypto space, and retrieval of money is next to impossible. So that is, I think, going to be a fundamental challenge to that ecosystem. And one of the things that I've been pushing for from Silverado perspective to just deal with ransomware is that we need better transparency into that ecosystem. We need KYC rules, know your customer rules, AML, anti-money laundering rules, and all these different exchanges to make sure that you don't have illicit actors, ransomware operators, drug traffickers, tax evaders, and the like using crypto to facilitate their nefarious operations.
Dmitri, thank you. What a pleasure. And oh my gosh, you're one of my heroes. I tell you this all the time. Thank you for your incredible service. Thank you for helping me build McAfee back in the day. Congratulations on Crowdstrike. Appreciate all the work with the Silverado and your institute as well. And I can see you're not retired like me. We love this, and we love the mission. We love giving back, and thank you for everything you've done. Thank you for coming on here. I hope to see you around. You look good, my friend, and I know what jacket to get you next time I see you. I'll get one like that somehow, maybe a little different color. But thanks for coming on the show here, and I appreciate it.
Thank you, Dave. You've been a great friend over the years, a tremendous mentor. A lot of my success I attribute to you and the lessons I learned from you working for you at McAfee. So thank you for everything you've done for the industry, and that you continue to do with the NightDragon platform.
Happy holidays, my friend. Hope you have a great holidays, and we'll see you around. Take care now. Bye. Bye, everybody. Take care.